For several months after my deconversion, I considered myself neither atheist nor theist. This is because, at that time, I presumed that the definition of theism was belief in God, and that correspondingly, atheism was a lack of belief in God. And those stances made no sense unless you first defined what you meant by the word God. Of course, if one meant an invasive supernatural being, then I was an atheist. However, it was also possible to assign the word God to things that obviously existed, such as the entirety of the universe itself, or the creative forces of the universe, where creative force meant everything from stellar nucleosynthesis to human engineering. In respect to these definitions of God, I was a theist. To say that one was an atheist towards these definitions would be patently absurd. It would be tantamount to saying that you did not believe in the entirety of the universe, or that you did not believe in stellar nucleosynthesis and human engineering. And so I continued with this philosophical stance for a long time, determined to point out to both self-proclaimed atheists and self-proclaimed theists how absurd their position was if they didn't first define their use of the word God. Two people arguing about the existence or non-existence of God were clearly wasting their breath if they didn't first define what they meant by God. However, eventually I ran across the proper definition of theism, and realized that atheism was an intuitive negation of theism. So people who were not theists were atheists. These definitions fit the most common debates I saw on the internet as well, where on one side of the debate there was a Christian theist arguing for the existence of an invasive supernatural being, and on the other there was an atheist arguing that the Christian's arguments were inadequate for establishing that being's existence. And so, by this definition, I was an atheist. It was a strange, liberating, and slightly amusing experience to realize this. I was an atheist. After all these years of thinking that atheists were cynical, nihilistic, and negative people, I realized that I myself was an atheist. I was an atheist. I repeated the proposition over and over in my mind as I walked through the grocery store on this day of realization. I am an atheist. I am an atheist. Of all people, I, the otherwise lifelong Christian, and relentlessly positive person, am an atheist. This realization blew my mind. At the time, I had never met an atheist who took the same approach to conversation that I did. Even the professor, who was still a very kind person and relentlessly patient overall, was very rough around the edges compared to me. One thing I had noticed about many atheists I had met as atheists, the professor included, was their tendency to commit the appeal to ridicule fallacy. Some atheists I met seemed to do this compulsively, rejecting claims purely on the grounds that they sounded unusual or contrary to common sense. However, I had learned through several examples in my ethics class that common sense, which is usually just an appeal to popular opinion, is not a sound basis for argument. One such example my ethics professor used was the case of Stella Liebeck, who had sued McDonald's because she had burned herself with their coffee. Even bringing this example up elicited jeers from the class about how sue-happy some Americans were, and how ridiculous it was that she would sue over burning herself with coffee. That was, until the ethics professor revealed that, at that time, McDonald's required franchises to serve coffee at 180 degrees Fahrenheit, and that the woman had suffered burns to her thighs, buttocks, and genitals that had required 8 days of skin grafting and 2 years of medical treatment. After the professor revealed these facts, the class sat in a solemn and humbled silence. I personally was shocked at how skewed my perspective of the situation had been before I'd gathered all the necessary facts to truly understand it. This example revealed to me that sometimes, when we casually appealed to common sense, we had the frightening potential to be not only ignorantly uninformed, but also blunderingly cruel to the very people that we would be defending if we had instead withheld judgment before gathering all the facts. As the ethics professor had shown, the problem with common sense, with its knee-jerk criticisms of the unfamiliar, is that it is too uninformed to be reliable. Getting to the heart of unusual claims requires real investigation, and I had seen many atheists compulsively reject religious claims purely on the grounds that they were unusual. To be fair, I had also seen many theists compulsively reject evolution and compulsively accept the validity of religious experiences for the same common sense-based reasons. Over time, though, I did meet atheists with the same approach to conversation as me, people who took great pains to be calm, diplomatic, and fair. I slowly began to realize that I was far from alone in this gentler type of atheism. I slowly discovered that these more soft-spoken atheists were everywhere, and were often quiet people who I had never imagined were atheists and had always assumed were Christian. And something else I realized over time was that even most of the louder atheists had a soft spot when you spoke to them in private. And most of the time they were rude not out of sheer spite, but because of their frustration at having experienced repeated encounters with the logical fallacies that permeated most religious thinking, and their resentment towards the negative impacts that religion had had on society. One stance I grappled with briefly was agnosticism. The stance of agnosticism most commonly means the belief that we don't have enough evidence to know for certain whether or not God exists. This stance seems to have arisen primarily from a mistaken belief that most non-atheists have about atheists, and that is the belief that most atheists are strong atheists, which means the belief that the theistic God does not exist. At first glance, this may seem identical to the definition of atheism I used earlier, which can be restated as a lack of belief in the theistic God, but it is actually very different. In order for one to state God does not exist, they would have to know everything about the universe, and they would have to know that our universe does not contain a God. As the agnostic rightly points out, this is not humanly possible. We are limited beings, and our knowledge and perception are limited to an infinitesimally smaller scale than the entire universe. However, I have never met an atheist who, when pressed, identified as a strong atheist. Rather, every atheist I have ever seen address this issue identifies themselves by the definition I have been using, which is simply a lack of belief in God, which means that these atheists are not claiming to know that God doesn't exist. They aren't even claiming to have good evidence that God doesn't exist. Rather, they are simply not persuaded by the arguments that theists have presented. They simply have not encountered good enough evidence to persuade them. Atheists in this category can most unambiguously be identified as agnostic atheists, which means they are atheistic because they do not have a belief in the existence of a supernatural being, and they are agnostic because they do not claim to know that that supernatural being does not exist. So, in my experience, basically all atheists are agnostics, and most agnostics are also atheists since they almost never have a positive belief in God. As a theist, I saw the stance of agnosticism as giving a concession to theism, meaning that since agnostics are not claiming to know that the God of theism does not exist, that they think people are logically justified to believe in him, despite not having solid evidence for him. This is not the case. My own agnostic stance is that, without evidence, people are no more justified to believe in the theistic God than they would be to believe in ghosts, psychics, leprechauns, UFOs, fairies, polytheistic gods, or reincarnation without solid evidence. For the same reasons that we must be agnostic to the existence of the theistic God, we must also be agnostic to the existence of all these things. Agnosticism gives the God of theism no more grounds for existing than it does any of these other concepts and beings. So at this point in my journey, I had established two hypotheses. One was that theists had used bad arguments to attempt to establish the existence of the theistic God. This made me an agnostic atheist. The other was that a concept of God as something greater than ourselves could still be spoken of meaningfully in some form of non-theistic God. At this point I was a pantheist, but more generally I was a non-theist, which is a term that people with this stance towards God language sometimes use to refer to themselves. As I continued my journey, I pursued both of these hypotheses in parallel.